Hi there, this is a read aloud recording for lesson 2.02 Moving Towards Independence. By 1774, the rising tension between Britain and the colonies reached a crisis point. A number of colonists joined groups such as the Sons of Liberty to denounce the actions of the British government. Letters raced back and forth across the colonies as the committees of correspondence wrote to inform each other of the latest threats to their liberties. As word spread about the Boston Massacre, as word spread about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the Intolerable Acts, colonists became more and more indignant. When the British closed the port of Boston, many colonists decided that angry words were not enough. It was time to act. Don't forget to get your lesson resources, which include um, your reading guide and your lesson answer key. Goals for this lesson: analyze the message and impact of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, identify key individuals in the independence movement, identify major events, leaders, and foreign assistance during the American Revolution, describe the purpose, members, and accomplishments of the First and Second Continental Congress, recognize the events at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill as the beginnings of hostilities between Britain and the colonies. And just a reminder, get those lesson resources. And let's begin. Come on, page, turn. Okay, so we're going to read pages 124 to 137. Okay, we got some reading to do, so let's get started. 124. The First Continental Congress. Back in 1754, the British government could barely even get 7 colonies to send representatives to the Albany Congress, convened to forge a more unified American role in the French and Indian War. But on September 5, 1774, 55 leaders from 12 colonies, only Georgia was missing, gathered in Philadelphia to begin 7 weeks of secret meetings. They called themselves the Continental Congress and sat down to discuss their common grievances and plan how to respond to the Parliament and King. In the course of their discussions, they got to know each other very well. The delegates were men of substance and means, mostly third and fourth generation Americans. From Virginia came Patrick Henry and George Washington, both planters and statesmen. From Massachusetts came John Adams and his firebrand cousin Sam Adams. And from New York came the young lawyer John Jay, and from Pennsylvania the farmer lawyer John Dickinson. All these men from diverse places and backgrounds listened to each other's stories. They found their regional differences dissolving in the face of the common interest that united them against recent British actions. All America is thrown into one mass, said Patrick Henry. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I'm not a Virginian, but an American. Still, the delegates had their differences. Some said to the Boston cousins, Sam and John Adams, were beginning to imagine a possible war with England. But most, like Pennsylvania's John Dickinson, simply hoped that if the colonies united in their opposition, the King and Parliament would back down and peacefully restore the colonists' rights as Englishmen. Even in their disagreements, the delegates were learning to stand together. They composed a list of grievances and called for Parliament to repeal numerous acts issued in the past decade. The Congress passed a resolution saying that if Britain used force to carry out the intolerable acts, all America ought to support Boston in their opposition. The Congress also praised what were called the Resolves, resolutions passed by a convention of several Suffolk County, Massachusetts towns, proposing to refuse to pay any taxes to the crown until the intolerable acts were repealed. Before adjourning, the delegates to the Continental Congress voted to boycott all trade with Britain. Until Parliament ended all attempts to tax the colonies, no British goods could be imported and no colonial goods exported to the mother country. The delegates then agreed to wait and see what happened in the months ahead. If Parliament withdrew the intolerable acts and stopped trying to tax the colonies, then all would be well. But Britain continued its oppressive ways. Then the delegates resolved to meet again the following May to determine a course of action. And here's an interesting, I want to bring this up to you because this is a pretty popular political cartoon called Join or Die. And it says, this political cartoon by Ben Franklin appeared with Franklin's editorial in 1754 about the importance of uniting the colonies in defense against the French. Later, colonists used the cartoon to promote colonial unity against the British. So you see all the parts of the snake there are standing for the colonies. North Carolina, V for Virginia, M for Massachusetts, NY for New York, so forth. And all apart, they're not a good snake. I mean, it's a dying snake. But if they would all join together, they could be much stronger in opposition. So this is why it became a popular rallying cry in a way during the colonial times that the colonies need to band together against the British. Okay, here's a little excerpt about um, from Patrick Henry when he talked about his famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," and more about that. On to the next page. Lexington conquered. In November 1774, King George III wrote that the New England governments are in a state of rebellion. To deal with these unruly children, as the colonies were labeled by some members of Parliament, the king resolved to respond with swift and stern discipline. Blows, he wrote, must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. In April 1777, Sir Thomas Gage, a British general, had about 33,000 troops under his command in the Boston area. General Gage, who had not failed to observe the rising fury of the colonists, asked for more troops. The king scoffed at the request. Surely Gage had all the forces he needed to put down any resistance from ill-trained, disorganized colonial rabble. The colonists, however, had organized bands of citizen soldiers or militia. These militias were no match for British soldiers or skills or supplies, but they were a clear sign that if a need arose, many colonists were ready to fight. Some of these militias were called Minutemen, ready to assemble at a moment's notice to test the British troops. On a chilly mid-April day in 1775, General Gage ordered about 700 of his troops to march to Concord, a town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. Their mission was to confiscate all the weapons the colonists were storing in Concord. But before the British troops reached Concord, Boston's Patriot Committee learned of their plans. The committee sent out the two Sons of Liberty, William Dawes and Paul Revere, to warn the militiamen. Shortly after midnight, Revere rode across the Charles River and galloped on horseback through the Massachusetts countryside, rousing militiamen with the news that the British troops were coming their way. Revere and Dawes were both captured before reaching Concord, but a third Patriot horseman, who had joined them on the small town of Lexington, eluded his captors and made it through to deliver the warning. Local Minutemen hurried through the night to the town green at Lexington, where they waited to information for about an hour. Finally, their commander said they could relax, but keep alert for the beat of a drum, which would be the signal to form ranks against the opposing troops. Some men went home, others in a nearby tavern. At 4:30 in the morning, a beating drum brought the men rushing back to the field in time to see red-coated British troops marching toward them. One frightened militiaman wanted to leave and urged his comrades to join him. "There are so few of us," he said. "It is folly to stay here." The militia's commander ordered his men to stay, and most did until the British commander cried, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse!" The militiamen scattered, but didn't put down their muskets. Then someone, no one really knows if it was a militiaman or a British soldier or a colonial Minuteman, fired a shot, the first shot of the American Revolution. More shots rang out from both sides. Within a few minutes, 8 militiamen were dead and 10 wounded. Only one British soldier was injured, his leg grazed by a bullet. The militiamen ran, and the British soldiers marched on, with fifes playing and drums beating. When the British troops reached Concord, they found that most of the ammunition had been removed. They took what remained and returned back to Boston, not knowing what awaited them on their way. The shot heard round the world. On both sides of the road, colonial militiamen hid behind trees and stone walls. Firing from cover rather than following the European tradition of standing in ordered ranks in an open field, the colonists turned the British march into a bloody ordeal. At day's end, 73 British soldiers were killed, and about 200 were wounded or missing. Preparing for war. The fighting at Lexington and Concord made clear the British had rebellion on their hands. But was it a revolution? Many colonists still professed their loyalty to King George III, even as they fired muskets at His Majesty's soldiers. They thought that if they resisted with arms, England would relent. But England did not relent. No, and most colonists were determined to resist by force. They had to find weapons and ammunition. Most of all, they had to organize an army. The Green Mountain Boys take Ticonderoga. In general, New Englanders relied on a militia system that required all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 65 to guard and defend their communities. Oh, where did I lost my page? to guard their communities when needed. In their everyday lives, the militiamen were farmers, shoemakers, mechanics, and storekeepers who could fight enthusiastically but knew or cared little about the military routines of marching, digging trenches, and taking orders. The British Army, on the other hand, was a highly disciplined fighting force with some of the most modern weapons in the world. Oh, from all their strengths, however, the British troops had one critical disadvantage. They were far from home on a land that had suddenly turned hostile, and they needed food and supplies. The colonists used this disadvantage to their benefit. After the British soldiers reacted, retreated, to Boston, nearly 20,000 colonial militiamen left their farm, shops, and homes to surround the city and lay siege to the British garrison. The British were cut off from farms in the countryside where they would normally have gotten more food. Although the militiamen surrounded Boston, they had little gunpowder and few firearms. Some New England businessmen set out for them. Set, Although the militiamen surrounded Boston, they had little gunpowder and few firearms. Some New England businessmen set out to fix this. They knew of a large store of weapons left over from the War of France in a fort in the shore of Lake Champlain. The men approached a tough Vermont backwoodsman named Ethan Allen. They asked whether he and his followers, known as the Green Mountain Boys, named after a mountain range in Vermont, could capture the fort and its weapons. Colonel Allen, as he was known, said they could. Joined by Benedict Arnold, at this time an officer in the Connecticut militia, was still a patriot, though he later turned traitor. Allen and his men rode across Lake Champlain. Allen, in the early mornings of May 10, 1775, Allen's band caught the British soldiers by surprise as they slept. The Green Mountain Boys walked into Fort Ticonderoga without firing a shot. They took the fort and captured more than 100 valuable cannons. In November, General Henry Knox went to Ticonderoga and brought home back the arms. Using a ox-drawn sled, his men hauled more than 120,000 pounds of weaponry across 300 miles of ice and snow to Boston. Okay, continuing on here, the next page. The Battle of Bunker Hill. Back in Boston, the British were astounded to find themselves suddenly surrounded by the colonists. The militiamen took up positions behind a hastily erected barricade on Breed's Hill near Bunker Hill in Charlestown, New Jersey. In Charlestown, just north of the city, a strategic position for cannon batteries. Not wanting to be trapped, the British commanders decided to drive the American militiamen from the hill. On June 17, 1775, British soldiers marched up the hill in orderly formation. The bright red coats made easy targets for the sharp-shooting militiamen at the top of the hill. According to some accounts, the colonial commander didn't waste any gunpowder, so he told his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The militiamen waited. When the British soldiers were almost upon them, the militiamen fired, and the British soldiers fell in bloody ranks. Late in the afternoon, the militiamen ran out of gunpowder and abandoned the hill. British soldiers finally took control and won the Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known. But their losses were devastating, 226 killed and 828 wounded. The Americans suffered 140 dead and 271 wounded. 1,000 casualties in a single battle, the British were shocked. King George III immediately ordered 30,000 additional troops across the Atlantic. The Americans, meanwhile, gained confidence that perhaps they could stand up to this mighty foe. The Second Continental Congress forms a Continental Army. In May of 1775, only a few weeks after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Boston's leading financier and shipper, John Hancock, was elected president of the Congress. And actually, I'm going to stop right here because we're almost at the time limit for this first video, and we'll pick up here in the first full paragraph in video part 2.